Hey, this is Enaa, in with you in the Fight Back, and today I want to talk about Mao Zedong's critique of Soviet economics, and hopefully later on to compare it to Trotsky's view of the Soviet Union. But first, on to Mao. I have to admit, before I read this work, my views on Mao were he largely wanted to copy the Soviet system, and he was pretty much an unrepentant Stalinist. Although I think Mao probably has certainly has a more positive view on Stalin than Trotsky did. His views were much more nuanced than I originally gave him credit for. And this work was written after the Great Leap Forward and all the problems associated therein. And it is not so much a critique of Stalin from a historical perspective, but looking at the problems that China is facing at that critical point in history, and Mao is looking at some economic textbooks and some works of Stalin, namely the economic problems and socialism. Now, Mao sees that the Soviet Union underwent a form of primitive socialist accumulation. He may not use those exact words, but essentially it was like that. And that there was a contradiction between town and country, and it leads to, in the Soviet Union, this led to a form of elitism in their mass work. And administrative methods were taken. The Soviets were much more willing to just use the bureaucracy and the state machine, the secret police. Problems among the population were handled often with rather brutal methods. And accumulation for building up the economy in the Soviet Union was done with an overemphasis on heavy industry and often at the expense of the peasantry. And this was seen as a rather mechanical idea that if you simply build up the economy, there will be changes in the superstructures, well, ideas and politics and so forth will change of their own accord. And this is a rather mechanical method of thinking that Mao does not approve of. Because whatever else you say about Mao, he's certainly willing to rely on popular initiative. He's willing to say to the population, experiment, give something a try. Let's see what we can do together. And Mao sees that Soviet problems, like there were really changes in rural relations and production that it really it was just done from an administrative point of view. The masses were not involved. The masses were not engaging in so much. They're just being told, do this, do that, do the other thing. And because of this whole commandist structure is you have the rather bourgeois methods, the bourgeois survivals in the superstructure. You have these ideas, one-man management. You don't really have workers' control in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And Mao was saying that mere growth of the economic base is not sufficient for socialism. It's not going to happen that way. What you need is you need the role of the masses. The party is part of the revolutionary process, but it isn't this be-all, command-all. There is the masses. And there are no laws that can merely just be applied. You can't just have some plan that decides everything. You need mass initiative. If it's not there, it's not going to happen. And Mao sees the socialist revolution largely on three fronts: politics, economics, and ideology. And although the Soviet Union did develop a very strong industrial base, it was kind of maladjusted. There was no balanced growth. It was all heavy industry. And the more I've read about China on this, is I really think China, although they made heavy industry the leading role in the economy, it was much more balanced. There was much more emphasis on light industry and on agriculture. It's much more balanced. And despite what naysayers may say, China, at least under Mao, certainly was the industrial growth was rather balanced, and it wasn't this environmental disaster that we would often see among Soviet economic projects. And the Soviets, according to Mao, don't really see change. They don't really see much in terms of the contradictions of socialism, the movement there, the contradiction between relations of production and forces of production. And they're not really willing to socialist democracy. Again, the masses are not in command. You need politics in command. What are the motive forces? And Mao was certainly willing, and this is leading up to the Cultural Revolution itself. As I said in an earlier video, the New Democracy, certain cadres were, although they joined the Communist Party, their interests were not in socialism and communism so much, but rather in a bourgeois revolution with independence, some land reform, some controlled capitalism. Yet they really weren't willing to push for socialism. And this is sort of getting this. These cadres, they're willing to reinforce a lot of these administrative, these Soviet methods, which really aren't socialist. They're bourgeois survivals in the superstructure. And Mao is saying, no, no, no. We need to start pushing past this bourgeois democratic revolution into a much more socialist phase. And he's saying these people who are in the party, who are willing to rely on administrative commandist methods, who are using bourgeois survivals, they're forming a bourgeoisie in the party. Mao is not quite saying this in the critique, but he is laying the groundwork for it, and it's quite important in that. And Mao is arguing also for the Soviets. They really weren't doing like the process of knowledge that you would find in On Practice. It was really just being told, do this, this is the method, the plan decided. There's no real practice, study, knowledge, and such. And Mao, in the Soviet Union, planning was just handed down from fiat on high from Stalin. We can argue that if Bukharin or Trotsky had plans, they were different. But under Stalin, the plans were just handed from fiat. They really didn't take the masses in command. Living standards declined under Stalin. And Mao was saying, we've got to put the masses before planning. The planning should be rather a guideline. And within that, we can make certain changes. It shouldn't just be administrative from the center. We need to have more input from the periphery, from the countryside. That's kind of what has to happen. And the growth has to be balanced. And just focusing on material incentive as the Soviets did, this is a bourgeois survival. It's one-sided. You need some kind of material incentive, but you need at the same time to have moral incentives. Where's politics in command? Where's worker politics? And the law of value deciding planning, that's another bourgeois survival. We got to start getting past that. We got to look at the changes in social relations and social institutions and start changing them. And how do we do that? We've got to have the masses. We've got to have the people who this revolution is for doing something for it. Now, if you don't have politics in command, if you don't have the mass line, that's not socialism according to Mao. That's a bourgeois survival. And those who want socialism will push for these things. They'll push for the mass line, balanced growth, and new changes in social institutions. But on the other hand, if you don't have that, if you're doing the more administrative commandist and these more unbalanced forms of growth, you're relying on bourgeois methods, the bourgeois survivals in the superstructure instead of challenging them. And ultimately, if you keep going down a certain road, you're going to lead back to capitalism. And this is part of what the Cultural Revolution was about, is between two roads, the socialist and the bourgeois. And they were located inside the Communist Party itself, between those who left in form, right in essence. And because of the Soviet method of doing this with agriculture, and China copied a lot of Soviet methods because that's what they were going on, there was disaster in agriculture in the Soviet Union. We don't have to go into that here. And Mao's arguing that there need to be more independence. And again, Stalin stresses technological cadre, the administrators. Mao's saying massive. Politics in command. You need to be expert, yes, in whatever field you're doing, but you need to be read. You need to have the right politics. Because if you're a manager and you act like a bourgeois manager in a socialist factory, what the hell's the difference? But if you're a manager who's subject to recall and workers' control and various forms of mass participation from party and local institutions, yes, you may be a manager, but your politics, if they're read, you're going to administer in a much different way. You're not going to just hand down commands. You're going to seek advice. And there'll be a dialectical interaction. And hopefully, I would hope that your position will be electable so you can be thrown out if you're not doing a good job. And Mao, of course, in contrast to the Soviets, is much more trustworthy with peasants. And Stalin, for instance, doesn't really speak of the superstructure, its relations to the base. It's more a mechanical, again, as I said. And again, Mao wants, and part of what Mao wants is not so, yes, he thinks you need this more balanced growth in the base, but the bourgeois survivals are not going to be taken care of on their own. Problems in culture, bourgeois survivals that exist from previous periods, they need to be challenged by mass participation. And these political conditions have to be fostered by the masses, by the party, who's taking a leading role. And leading is not the same as commanding. The party inspires through its activism, through its willingness to be the first to volunteer and the last to ask for reward, as a Cultural Revolution saying put it. And if you don't, and Mao is saying that rather than relying on these administrative commanders' methods, distrusting the masses, we need to trust them. We need to put them in command. And that's part of, and I believe a lot of this is, again, it's preliminary that what Mao's going on in the critique of Soviet economics. He's kind of looking at these texts of Stalin and Soviet textbooks, trying to figure out where do we go. And he's laying the groundwork for what later will become the theories of the Cultural Revolution. And again, this isn't a historical summation of Stalin and the Soviet experience, but it's laying the groundwork for a much radical different view of politics that Mao's developing in the Soviet Union, in China. And through his critique of Soviet economics, he's really laying the groundwork for what I would argue was a great method to carry a revolution within the revolution that we see in the Cultural Revolution. And this work of Mao is incredibly valuable. I believe it's free online if you can find it. So I urge you to check it out. This is Enaa, and we need to fly back. Until next time.